Good evening. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This is Rambling number 20, Noah, part 11. Noah, as you know, is the third of 16 names that we find listed in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. It has been my aim to give kind of an in-depth look at each of the lives of those 16 names that are mentioned there in order to understand how they got to be in the roll call of the faithful and how they became that great cloud of witnesses that chapter 12 speaks about. But before I get into that, I want to point out a new feature that's on the church website. That's parkhillchurchofchrist.com if you're not aware of what that is. And the new feature is the menu item labeled video that the arrow points to on the screen. Positioning your mouse on that word video will cause a drop-down menu to show up. And when that appears, you have listed there all of the series that currently exist and are stored on the church's website. Clicking on any of the options will display all of the videos in that particular series in a complete group from the latest one all the way back to the first one. And that video will be presented directly from the church's YouTube channel. That makes it much easier to find the videos than searching through Facebook or some of the other methods that you might use, even on YouTube, the YouTube channel. And also, by using that format, the videos are a little better as far as resolution is concerned. And one of the nice things about it is, as soon as a new video has been put up there by whoever created the video, that video becomes immediately available to be viewed from anyone who happens to get onto the church's website and click in that area. So I encourage you to do that. It's just a good way to provide the information that needs to be distributed. Our lesson today, though, is looking into what happened outside the flood during that year the ark was afloat. As you might expect, this subject has been an ongoing discussion for years, many years in fact, because really no one on the earth knows what actually happened, at least not with any degree of certainty, during that year. Creationists typically will say that the world endured significant changes during that year, and that those changes were so severe that the world that was ceased to exist. It was destroyed in favor of a new world. And I think they get that from Peter's second letter that you see there in chapter 3. And I've got it quoted on the screen and underlined the two lines that caused them to make that decision. I don't know that they were correct in that, but that was the way it was viewed back then. As you might expect, many in the scientific community argue against such a significant change in such a short period of time. Scientists believe that the change would have been much more gradual and that it would have occurred over a greater period of time. And they have data that back up their conclusions, and we'll talk about that later on. It's not my intention to address the major argument between creationists and the scientific community, since in this session we're addressing the flood and the flood only. The Bible clearly says and provides the exact date that the flood began. It was on the 17th day of the second month in Noah's 600th year. And as we discussed earlier in this series, creationists often take the position that prior to the flood, our planet was one large, completely connected landmass called the Pangaea that was surrounded with water. Typically, they further believe that during the flood and the turmoil that occurred during the flood, all of the earthquakes and the volcanic actions and things of that sort, all the things that were happening under the ground, that it caused the tectonic plates deep within the earth to break apart and to shift. And they shifted enough, according to creationists, that it transformed our planet from that one completely connected landmass that you see there, the Pangaea, into what it is today. Our present world, which includes all of the continents and the major islands and so forth that are in the sea. The scientific community, on the other hand, deny that. And they take the position that the continents are actually not appreciably different in size or shape or even location than they were 4,500 years ago, which is about when the flood would have occurred. They claim that their data proves that over the past several hundred years, the total movement of the tectonic plates that has not been more than just a few centimeters. They calculate that at most, using the figures that they have collected over the past several hundred years, that those tectonic plates, meaning those continents, the land masses that you see here in the oceans and that are there, did not move more than just a few feet over that 4,500 years, if they moved that much. Creationists, on the other hand, believe that before the flood, there were no extremely tall mountains, no extremely deep valleys. Instead, the surface of the landmass was relatively smooth and gentle, kind of a rolling hillside, if you will, meaning that those hills and elevation changes were not anywhere near what they are today. Therefore, to arrive at what we see on our planet today, creationists make the claim that during the flood, there were those earthquakes, those volcanic actions that we talked about, that there was great distress that caused giant crevasses to occur and mountains being pushed up by the shifting tectonic plates and causing huge layers of rock and soil to push above ground and to change the Earth's surface from what it was to what it is today. Added to that is the massive water runoff, which quickly caused a tremendous amount of erosion, creating some of the Earth's natural wonders like this picture of the Grand Canyon and others. The scientific community, though, takes the position that over the course of time, great changes indeed were happening. But those changes did not happen in 1 year, nor did they begin with the flood 4,500 years ago. Scientists speak in ages and eons. They talk about occurrences that occur over an enormous period of time that formed the Earth to be what it is today. They say it was not done quickly, but over millions of years. Therefore, in their eyes, the last 5,000 years or so produced very little changes, and things then were just about the same as things today. I've always believed that by and large, scientists are honest, certainly honest in their endeavors to search for the truth. But creationists, as well as scientists, are human. All humans make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes draw wrong conclusions. One of the reasons scientists look with a jaundiced eye on the global flood story about Noah is that they have proved, without doubt, they say, that the Earth's atmosphere does not contain enough water for it to rain over the entire surface of the Earth for even 5 days, let alone 40 days and 40 nights. I would probably agree with that. But from the creationist point of view, one of the things necessary is a global flood. A local flood would not annihilate the trillions of humans that were alive at the time, as well as all life in which was the breath of life. You may have seen this slide before. I used it a few years ago when we were discussing the flood being a global flood rather than a local flood, as some want to make it. The debate over Noah's flood is not new. It's been going on for more than 200 years. Back then, reliable, scientific, and geological information was hard to find. Some of it didn't even exist yet. And that which did exist was difficult to obtain. As is often the case, the result of a lack of good information ends with speculation and incorrect conclusions. And for that reason, some of the conclusions and explanations from 200 years ago, though they might have sounded right at that time, might not have been right. An example of such is the explanation that the mountains were not nearly as high then as they are now. That conclusion was reached by creationists to combat a statement a fact that the scientists had made about there not being enough water for a global flood to cover the highest mountains. Fortunately, over the last 200 years, and especially over the last 50 years, there have been major advancements in technology, as well as technique, coupled with new and better instruments and equipment, and they have provided us a much greater database of information than what was available 200 years ago, or even 60 years ago. And it has been released to the general public. Much of it is available on the internet. Much of it is available on the internet for anyone who cares to see it. And the result of that new data has caused geologists to begin to back away from that idea of there not being enough water to flood the earth entirely. And I thought that perhaps it may be time that we creationists began to back away from some of those older views that were thought up and arrived upon 200 years ago, or some more, some less, and may have even been speculation in the first place. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Listen to me carefully. We are not discussing sacred doctrinal matters. Whether the earth had one large land mass before the flood, or if it has always looked the way it looks now, should not affect our faith. Our faith is not dependent upon the size of the mountains then and now. I'm still a creationist. I do not, and I will not, believe anything such as the Big Bang Theory, evolution, or any other idea that might arise that concerns how things came into existence. I accept the Bible as God's truth. And when it tells me that God created everything that is in 6 days, I believe it. And when the Bible tells me that the floodwaters covered the tallest mountains to a depth of 15 cubits, I believe it. So what do I intend to do in this lesson? I'm not going to present any information to support the typical creationist view that there were no high mountains. Neither am I going to present information to support the view that there was only one landmass prior to the flood. Instead of that, I intend to present information which I believe will show us clearly that the flood was universal, that it occurred exactly like the Bible says, and that there was enough water to cover the highest mountain with at least 23 feet of water. The tallest mountain in the world is Mount Everest, which, by the way, would not have had snow on it before the flood because of the canopy of water vapor that we talked about several lessons ago. But it very well may have been as high then as it is now. And I'm going to assume, for the sake of this session, that it was. That the earth hasn't changed that much over the past 4,500 years, and that it did not completely destroy itself in the flood and was not created anew by God after the flood. I'm not saying I don't believe that those things happened, but I'm saying in this lesson, for this session in Noah's life, I'm going to accept Scripture, but I'm also going to look at science. The tallest mountain in the world, as I said, is Mount Everest. It is 29,000 feet above sea level. The peak is 29,000 feet. If we accept the Scripture, like I plan to do, that means that we recognize that the depth of the water, in order to be above the peak of Mount Everest by at least 15 cubits, which is roughly 23 or 24 feet, the surface of the water would have been almost 5 miles deep. 5 miles higher than normal sea level. That sounds like a lot. And to someone who is only 5 feet 11, it is a lot. 5 miles, if it were a wall stacked up 5 miles high, and someone 6 feet tall stood and looked at it and looked up it, it would be way up there. But the truth is, we're looking at it through the wrong perspective. Perspective is putting everything into the sizes that we can grasp and easily understand. A gentleman by the name of Gaines Johnson, who just happens to be a geologist, says that for us to picture the true ratio of a flood that was 5 miles deep, we have to put the earth and Mount Everest and the Great Flood all into perspective. And he says the easiest way to do that is to picture the planet Earth, which we know is 25,000 miles in circumference. And we know that the Earth's crust is somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 miles thick or deep. So to give us a better perception of that thickness of the Earth's crust, when we compare it to the Earth's size, Mr. Johnson says that we need to picture the Earth as the size of a basketball. Now, we can do that. All of us pretty much have seen basketballs. Maybe we have even held basketballs in our hands. We know how big basketballs are. So let's assume that the Earth is the size of a basketball. If we were to do that, then the Earth's crust, that is that 35 to 40 mile thick skin, if you will, around the Earth, when reduced to the size of a basketball, would be about the same thickness as a piece of tissue, Kleenex, that was draped over the side of it. Now, if you were to take a Kleenex and you were to dampen it with water and just lay it on and smooth it out over the surface of that basketball that you're holding in your hands, that Kleenex represents 40 miles, maybe 35 miles at the least, the crust of the earth. Compared to that, what is 5 miles of water? It's just a minute quantity. It only increases the overall circumference of the earth by 0.04%. To the earth, 5 miles is nothing. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind that when God created the firmament to sever or to divide the waters, the average sea level after God divided the waters, the actual sea level of the water that remained on the earth would be significantly lower than it is now. The reason for that is almost half of the water is up in that canopy of water above our atmosphere then, during Noah's time and before. Now, after the flood, that water was the source of the rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, that water is on the earth. So the sea level of our earth now is significantly higher than it would have been in Noah's time, when that half of the water was up above the atmosphere. And that might account for the fact that people thought the landmass was one big large mass, because with half the water gone and the lower sea level, you probably would have been able to walk across parts of oceans that exist now. And it may very well be that there was dry land paths between the continents, even separated like they are today. The absence of that water might very well make the difference, rather than the shifting of the tectonic plates. This slide is a graphic representation of the Earth's structure. Notice that the center of the Earth, the inner core, begins at about 5,100 kilometers, about 5,000 kilometers, which equals about 3,200 miles deep. And it extends to the center of the Earth, which is about 4,000 miles deep. The entire crust of the Earth varies in depth from up to about 100 kilometers. And it's labeled the lithosphere, as you can see in this slide. And that includes the extreme upper portion of the Earth, the mountain ranges, the ocean, and the sediment that's there. This is a magnified view of the lithosphere, and it shows the continental crust, the sedimentary deposits, and the oceanic crust. In addition to that, it shows the asthenosphere below the lithosphere. The continental crust is the relatively thick part of the Earth's crust that forms the larger land masses that exist, and extends down to about 50 or maybe even 60 kilometers, maybe 31 miles or so. The sedimentary deposits sit along the coastlines, and they're made up mostly of sand and rock, and they're only a few hundred feet deep, or maybe even less than that. Most of us have walked along the seashore, and we're very familiar with those coastlines. The orange layer that you see is the oceanic crust, and it actually forms the bottom of the shallower parts of the ocean. It goes down to a depth of around 3, maybe as much as 25 miles, depending on which ocean we're talking about and where in the world it might be. Below all of those layers that are labeled the lithosphere and the asthenosphere, and those are the parts that we're interested in, the lithosphere and the asthenosphere. They extend from the bottom of the continental crust and or the oceanic crust and go down to a depth of between 32 to as much as 125 miles on average. Before looking further at the lithosphere, I want to address again Genesis chapter 6 and verse 13. The passage reads, as you can see on the screen, that God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. It is said by some creationists that this passage means that God's intent was to destroy both all the flesh, that's every air-breathing mammal and human that existed except for the ones that were on the ark. And he was going to destroy the earth, meaning the old earth, the way it was. Remember that passage in 2 Peter we read a few minutes ago. And recreate the earth after the flood. But I want you to realize something that we often overlook when we read that passage and others, and that is it was the earth that was filled with violence. But it wasn't the earth that was the cause of the violence. The cause of the violence was the flesh that was on the earth. Well, the humans, primarily, that was on the earth. The earth itself was still perfect. God had made it perfect when he created it. He was well pleased with it, he said, at the end of those 6 days. And it hadn't changed. It had stayed the same all that time. 1,656 years passed between Adam and Eve and the time that the flood came on in Noah's 600th year. The earth did not need destroying. The earth was not at fault. But what this passage actually means, I think, is that God was going to use the earth to destroy the evil flesh that occupied the earth. Genesis 7 and verse 11 provides us the answer to where enough water came from to flood the earth with water 5 miles deep. The 2 sources are mentioned there. The fountains of the deep, from which the water was coming up from underground, and the windows of heaven, from which the water was falling down from above, that canopy, that big storehouse of water that is above our atmosphere, or that was above our atmosphere during Noah's time. So let's address those things. And let's first address the windows of heaven. That's the rain that came falling down. As we said earlier, scientists tell us that there was not enough water in the air to rain over the whole earth for even a few days, let alone the 40 days and 40 nights that the scripture talks about. But the scriptures say that God opened the windows of heaven, which turned loose that vast storehouse, that vast overhead supply of water that existed. And that fell for 40 days and 40 nights. The scientists do not take that into consideration because they don't think it happened. The scriptures say it does and did. It wasn't just ordinary rain. It was the water that was stored up there that is mentioned in Genesis 1, verses 6 and 7, that fell. The fountains of the deep were the other source. At the same time that God opened the windows of heaven, He also broke up the fountains of the deep. It is typically understood that this means the oceans, the seas, the rivers, and the lakes that overflowed their banks. But that isn't really what it means. In order to understand the fountains of the deep, we need to know a little bit more about our Earth. I feel pretty sure that most all of us have had several science classes, even beginning in our elementary years of school and going all the way through college. So we pretty well understand that the Earth is not just a big ball of loose dirt. This slide is a cross-section that shows a small section of that lithosphere that we talked about a while ago, 2 or 3 slides back. It's the outer crust of our planet. And as we said earlier, it is about 30 to 35 miles thick. When we look at the Earth as a basketball, it's only as thick as a piece of tissue paper. But it's comprised of various layers and levels of rock, soil, sand, and minerals. And it covers the entire globe of the Earth. It's even under the oceans. The colors that are on this drawing help us see the density differences and the hardnesses of the various areas that are shown and make up the Earth's crust. The top layer that you see in this drawing is represented by kind of a brownish yellow color, and it represents the soil that is familiar to us. It is the ground we walk on and dig in when we plant a garden. Under that upper soil lies the lower soil. It is colored that kind of a greenish yellow area, and it is comprised of soft earth, soil, sand, clay, rock, and minerals. And it's in this layer that we dig our mines to mine minerals such as gold and silver, copper, and other things. But also mixed in and under that lower soil are some layers of extremely dense clay and hard rock. That is shown in this drawing by those dark brownish purple colored areas in the drawing. The bottom one I have labeled confining unit, but that label applies to all 3 areas that you see that same color. Those confining layers of hard rock and soil and minerals prevent the blue layers, the aquifers that are shown here, from rising or lowering in the crust. The aquifers then are, if they're surrounded on both sides by the confining unit, they're considered to be confined aquifers. If they are not confined on both sides, then they're called unconfined aquifers. And every once in a while on the Earth you'll find a very small, very thin layer of a confining unit that's not very deep. And the aquifer that is above that is usually pretty shallow. And it's what we usually dig down to when we dig a well. Now, I call them aquifers. The blue areas, there's 3 different levels of it as you see in this drawing. They're called aquifers. They're similar to the yellowish green ground that we know, except the aquifers are comprised of very porous rock. maybe some sand mixed in, and other minerals. But they're very, very porous, so much so that they allow water to flow through them very easily. And if there is no escape, no way for the water to get out, then they become a storehouse of water that lies under the earth. According to geologists, especially in the last 50 years, they have instruments that can find that as deep as 100 kilometers. And they say that the Earth's crust is filled with many, many, many cubic miles of water that is stored in those porous aquifers. The number and the size of the aquifer was unknown 200 years ago. The geologists knew about aquifers. But as I said, information wasn't so widely available 200 years ago as it is today. Even the geologists didn't know how many there were, how deep they went, and how large they were, how much water they could hold. And as I said, they go down as far as 35 miles in some places. To put that in perspective, the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean is at the south end of the Mariana Trench. It's just southwest of Guam. The depth of the ocean there, that's the deepest part of the ocean on the earth, is 36,200 feet below sea level. That's about 7 miles deep. These aquifers go down 35 miles in some places on the earth. On the other hand, some aquifers, as I said, are much shallower. And that's why we can dig wells and find water only just 50 or 100 feet deep or less. Once in a while we see a crack or a slit or a hole that opens in the Earth's crust. When that happens, and if that slit or crack goes deep enough to reach an aquifer, water will flow out of that aquifer, and we call it a spring. Geologists call it a fountain. And there are two types of fountains that occur in nature. One is shown in this drawing, and it's labeled a flowing artesian well. As I said, quite often we call it a spring. Most all of us have seen places where water just seems to flow right out of the ground. No apparent reason. There's no river or no creek or anything nearby. It's just a slit in the ground where water comes out. We're familiar with that. The other type is called a geyser, and we're kind of familiar with that too, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But every once in a while, that crack or that slit or that hole that occurs in the Earth's crust goes deep enough to reach one of those confined aquifers, one that is deeper, larger, and confined between layers of hard clay and rock. And if you find one of them, they will provide lots of water day in and day out, year in and year out. The picture you see in the upper left on this screen is one of those. It is called Mammoth Springs, and it exists in the northeast corner of Arkansas, maybe toward the center part of the state, but on the eastern side. And it's not really a spring. It is a huge artesian well. You can tell by the picture that there's a lot of water flowing over that dam. In order to get the full meaning and the full impact of Mammoth Springs, you have to go there and visit it and see just how much water is coming out of it. I guarantee you it's worth the trip. Mammoth Springs qualifies as an inexhaustible source of water. What I mean by that is, we don't know how long it's been flowing. But in 1820, a small village was established because of Mammoth Springs. The village was called Mammoth Springs. And since Mammoth Springs is the source of the Spring River, it pours a lot of water that runs down toward the Arkansas River. I don't know how long before 1820 that spring has been flowing, but listen to this. Coming out of the mouth of Mammoth Springs is fresh, clean, clear water at a temperature of 58 degrees. Doesn't make any difference if it's the hottest day in August or the coldest day in December or January. The water that comes out of that spring is 58 degrees year-round. And that water comes out at the rate of 9 million gallons per hour. Stop to think about that. 9 million gallons per hour. And it never stops. Day in, day out. Year in, year out. And that's just one. There are many of them over the earth. There are even some aquifers that have no artesian well, no crack, no slit where the water's coming out. It's hard to envision, really, just how much water exists under the surface of our earth. The second type of fountain, as I said a while ago, is called a geyser. And in the upper right-hand corner of this picture, you see a photograph that I took of Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. A geyser occurs when waters in the underground chambers are heated to the point to where they immediately flash into steam. And when that happens, they erupt up through the fissure and spray out the water. Old Faithful goes up a good distance. It's another place you need to see in order to get the full benefit of what that means. Once all of that steam that has been forced out cools, and there is no more water in that chamber underground, then it quits. It's like someone just turned the tap off and the water quits coming out. It takes a while for that chamber to refill with water from the aquifer. But when it does, and when it heats up to the particular temperature where it flashes into steam, I'm assuming that's somewhere around 200 degrees or a little more Fahrenheit, then it all happens again. And the cycle keeps repeating day in, day out, year in, year out. Geologists now tell us, I'm talking about the modern geologists, the ones that have been working in geology over the last 50 years. They tell us that even the amount of water that might flow out of all of the natural fountains that exist on the Earth's surface, places like Mammoth Springs and Old Faithful and all the others that are there, even that would not flood the earth 5 miles deep. It would flood the earth perhaps, but not 5 miles deep. Genesis says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Doesn't that sound a whole lot like But if all the aquifers were to burst, the fountains of the deep were broken up. They brought forth that tremendous supply of underground water that's stored in the aquifers all over the earth. And the tallest mountains were covered. Then the rains fell. At the same time that the rain began to fall, the aquifers were burst, according to Genesis chapter 7. That lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. The tallest mountains were covered. Mount Everest was covered. 29,000 feet high. The peak, 23 feet underwater. 5 miles of water circled the earth. There were no land masses showing. All the people, all the creatures in which was the breath of life perished. And then, at the end of 40 days, the fountains of the deep had provided all the water they had. That vast storehouse in the sky, the canopy of water that Genesis 1 says was put up there, is depleted. It is all fallen to the earth as rain. So 40 days after the flood started, it stopped. The water stopped. All the water was on the earth, on the surface of the earth. Perhaps some still in some of the aquifers. But the fountains of deep had emptied. The canopy of water above the atmosphere had emptied. And the waters began to calm. If we understand correctly Genesis 7 and verse 24, the water stayed on the earth for 150 days before it began to recede. I take that to mean that the water was 5 miles deep for 150 days. I realize that may not be the case. It may very well be that the waters started to subside immediately after the 40 days were up. Whatever it means, the water was on the earth for 150 days. Let me rephrase that. The water prevailed on the earth for 150 days. And then it took 6 more months before the water completely was gone, and Noah and all the creatures that were in the ark could come out of the ark. The water seeped back into the aquifers, but now things were different. The waters above the firmament are no longer there. They no longer exist. The earth is going to change as far as atmosphere, as far as seasons, summer and winter, as far as the ice forming on the poles. Those are the changes that occurred to the earth. And we have one more part to talk about in Noah's life. It has to do with where the water went, what those changes were, and then Noah's life on the earth for the last 300 years. And we'll cover all of that in the next session. I hope you have a good evening. Thank you for watching. Good night.